Good afternoon and welcome. On behalf of Salem Hospital, it's our pleasure to make this venue available and invite you all to spend a few hours celebrating and talking about Garrett Smith. So my name is Tim Murphy. I'm the Administrative Director for the Department of Psychiatry, and I'm going to take a minute and just sort of explain what we'll do today, and then we'll have a series of different speakers come forward and present. We were talking a minute ago about, I was talking with Dr. Getz about Cicero, whether we couldn't remember if he was Greek or Roman. I think we decided he was Roman. But he said that life is composed of moments of great levitas and gravitas, moments of joy and moments of seriousness. And what we hope to do today is experience some of both, moments of joy and discussion as we talk a little bit about Garrett, and also moments of seriousness as we recall the powerful impact that he's made on our lives and many other people. So I invite you today to spend this time with us, with both realms of joy and seriousness. Today's ceremony will encompass, we're taking a kind of a multimedia approach. You've seen some pictures and slides, both of Garrett locally and some slides from his view in Mexico. We've played a little music, a little Mozart as you came in. We'll be ending with some different music. And throughout the afternoon, we will hear from folks and then ask for any of you if you would like to share a memory or a story, a thought regarding your relationship or how Garrett may have influenced you in your life and in your practice. I'd like to open by introducing the Director of Pastoral Care for Salem Hospital, Barry Heath, who's going to come forward and say a few words.
Well, Tim's done a wonderful job already of kind of setting the stage for what we are about. In talking with Garrett's colleagues about the nature of this particular time together, I learned about him through their eyes, and therefore learned about the true gifts that are the realities of his life. Because if you really want to know how someone impacts life, you don't best, or you can't best learn that by talking to them, but you can best learn that by talking to people whose lives have been impacted by that person. And certainly, as Tim mentioned, that's what we are about. At a time of memorial, it can also certainly be a time of sadness, and I picked up this bit of wisdom from a poet named Earl Barfoot, and I think I'd like to share it with you as a way of setting the stage for what we are about this afternoon. He writes, "Please don't cry at my funeral, except as you remember the beauty of life, and cry as one does in the presence of mystery, of the breathtaking beauty of creation. But for my life, give thanks, with me, for me. Say, it is complete, it has been perfected, and laugh and sing with joy." The joy that you will share in some moments as we share about the impact of Garrett's life on yours probably will bring some smiles, and maybe a little bit of a lump in the throat. But that is okay, for that is a part of the mystery of why we are here. Our purpose in a way this afternoon is to weave, if you will, a tapestry of Garrett's life, not to blow those memories out of proportion, for none of us is worthy of completely being held up on any kind of pedestal. In fact, if there is any testimony to Garrett's life, it was that he put other people that he was advocating for on the pedestal and not himself. And so as we share those memories, I think we do it in that way. We're weaving a tapestry of the things that have had meaning that we want to celebrate at his life, not to over-glorify him, but to give thanks for the gifts that have been shared by him and through you. And so we'll begin our sharing as Maggie or Tim is going to introduce to us who's going to be coming next.
One of the things that I get to do that I take great joy in, I get to do it frequently these days, is introduce Dr. Maggie Bennington Davis, who is the medical director for the Department of Psychiatry here at Salem Hospital, but also a champion of psychiatry and mental health in the state of Oregon and nationally. And it is absolutely a privilege to work with Maggie and Joy.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Barry. And I have to tell you that it's humbling to be in this room today, and it's an honor to be here among the people that Garrett touched and that Garrett loved and who loved Garrett. And Salem Hospital realizes the privilege inherent in being part of this great humanitarian's memorial service and his life's work. It's also a privilege to share this podium with two of our state's leaders from the Office of Mental Health and Addiction Services. Garrett, I know, was gratified that Madeline Olson and Bob Nickel led the state and continue to lead the state with an eye and ear always oriented toward the experiences of the consumers of mental health treatment in Oregon. Madeline and Bob's planning and development is part of Garrett's legacy. Madeline and Bob.
Thank you, Maggie. And I would like to thank Salem Hospital also for making this space available for us this afternoon. It's somewhat more pleasant than any space we would have readily available at the state offices. I've thought a lot about what I might say. I've sort of rehearsed it in my head over the days after I learned of Garrett's death, while I was running and in the shower and all of the times that I do thinking. And it's really hard to think about what to say, except that when I look back over the changes that I've been involved in the mental health system in Oregon, Garrett was right there. He was sort of in the middle of all of them and helping us think through the issues, think about the policy, and always do it from a perspective of what's the best thing for the consumer. And it's amazing to work with someone like Garrett and his set of values and the conscience he brought to the system. And probably Garrett had one of the best policy-making minds of anybody I've ever met. And among the kinds of things we did as colleagues, I think one of the most interesting to me was during probably the '95 legislative session during Ways and Means. And we've struggled from the time I started working with Barry, trying to help the legislature understand what is a mental illness, to understand that it's a disease, it's something that people recover from, it's not a moral failing. And we tried various kinds of methods for doing that. And this particular year, we decided, after I made some brief comments after Barry did his overview, that we would start with Garrett talking about his story and the Oregon system and what that system meant for him and what it meant for all of the people that he advocated on behalf of. And he did a brilliant job. It was just breathtaking. It caused them to actually listen, which isn't always an easy thing during Ways and Means hearings. And then things got very strange during the process, and the entire rest of the time that we had for Ways and Means was devoted to the developmental disability side because of the controversies around the closure of Fairview. And I was fussing to Barry. I really wanted to have people understand the importance of the mental health system, and I felt like I hadn't had a chance to tell them the information that they needed. And he basically said, look, Garrett did the job that needs to be done. Just be thankful and don't rock the boat. And it turned out just fine. And he was so affecting as he spoke to the legislature. And that's, among all of the other things he did at the state level, that was the one that, because it was sort of amusing and funny and touching, really stuck out for me. I was lucky enough to be able to continue my relationship with Garrett in his retirement. And to visit him and spend time with him in Mexico, and you saw some of the pictures. And one of the remarkable things about Garrett, I think, both as I observed him and as I experienced him personally, is that he met every single person where that person was with complete openness and total respect for the individual. And he did that in his culture and in Mexico. And because of that, I think two things resulted. He had friends everywhere, and every single one of us, for knowing Garrett, it brought out the best in us. We were always able to be the person he saw. And it was always a slightly better person for me than I thought I could be. And that's a wonderful, wonderful gift. And together with him in Mexico, we sat early morning hours in the misty air. The birds were just waking up. The music was quiet. The donkey across the arroyo was braying. And we would just watch the morning unfold. And the wonderful thing about Garrett always is he knew the name of every bird we could hear, every bird that we saw. We would sit there and just talk about all kinds of things. It was like we had been together forever and we hadn't seen each other for months. And then the last thing, two more things I want to share. The other thing we did the first time I was in Mexico is we sat out with our coats on, total dark. We're out in the country. There are no streetlights. And the full moon is coming up over the mountains behind the village. And we're in the dark, and then slowly the valley below us is just being bathed in moonlight. And it was just wonderful. And to find a person who's willing to take their time and just sit and watch the light change was such a gratifying experience for me. I feel like I've had a friendship cut short, but that Garrett has left so much for me that he'll always be part of me. And I think he'll be part of all of us. And I know that to the extent we continue to make progress in our system in Oregon, that will be part of Garrett too. So I think through us and through what we do, we'll keep Garrett and his values alive. And that's really important to me. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. Bob?
Thanks, Madeline. Sometimes people wonder how we can work at the state year after year, and I think under the guidance of Madeline and what you saw and the humanity that she expresses, and that we saw a lot from Garrett, I think it's a lot easier to understand why some of us keep doing this difficult work year after year. Thanks, Madeline. I'm going to try to keep this pretty short. I've already had a bit of a chance to say a few things about Garrett. I helped assemble the story of his life that's in the brochure. Had a lot of good help, and I appreciate those who contributed. I particularly want to acknowledge Elizabeth Garrett King Hess, who's here, and we'll talk after a little bit. I know she doesn't need to be introduced with 4 names all the time, but Garrett's in there somewhere. And Elizabeth and her mother, Zona, who couldn't be here because of health reasons, she's recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's and is in the process of a move. But I personally got to know Zona and really appreciated her at the time when Garrett had the horse accident. You all remember when he fell off the horse, nearly died. This building is part of the recovery story of that accident, actually. So it's, I think, a doubly nice thing that we're here today. Elizabeth and Zona really are responsible for our openness in the story that we've publicized about Garrett's life, for the fact that he was in recovery for both bipolar disorder and alcoholism. And it's not like most of us didn't know that. But we didn't want to say those things without the family's endorsement. I really appreciate, Elizabeth, you're telling us very bluntly that was an important part of Garrett, and we didn't need to keep it secret, and we didn't have to act like it wasn't so. In any sense. I was really lucky. Madeline mentioned the term luck. I was able to be with Garrett through a lot of different situations. I met him through Larry Krieger, and I want to acknowledge Larry being here today. Back in, I think, 1987, and Larry called me one day and said, 82? Well, my first memory of Garrett is his popping onto the scene as a field research.
Services West as the manager of the Catherine Apartments.
Yeah, I was just trying to talk about my own personal acquaintance with Garrett. Started, but I know that you and others were lucky to meet him sooner, and he was involved in other things. But Laurie called me one day and said that we were looking for a person to do field research for an NIMH project, and she said that Garrett would be a good person, and said that he was stable, he had bipolar disorder, but no concern. And at that point in my career, I wasn't quite convinced that that was a good thing. Garrett convinced me. He did a beautiful job, and then when I came to work for the state, I was very fortunate to work very closely with him through Laurie and Dave and others at the division at that time. Subsequently, I was able to be on speaking panels with him in Seattle and San Diego, and I'll never forget the trip we took to Washington, D.C. together to review some dual diagnosis homeless grants that the feds were putting out at that time. We walked around Washington, D.C. one evening for hours until both of us had our feet so sore we could barely get back on the subway, the metro, and get back to the hotel we were staying out in Bethesda. As we walked around D.C. that evening, Garrett, having been there during the early 60s and as an intern, as I understand it, worked in the old HEW offices, and he told me, well, this was the building where I met Danny Kaye, and one day Eleanor Roosevelt stopped in, and there was no one around at lunch hour, so I had no choice but to entertain her for half an hour. And I'm sure that must have been, I wish I had a transcript of that discussion. That must have been fascinating. I also spent time with Garrett in this wonderful state that we live in Pendleton and Lakeview and Wagon Tire. One of the most memorable trips we took was the trip through Wagon Tire, and we stopped and single-handedly doubled the population of Wagon Tire for an hour or so. There's so many things that I would like to talk about with Garrett, and I've asked myself, what really made Garrett who he was? And the term that keeps coming back to me is an old-fashioned one, and that is that Garrett had character. And we don't talk about that. He was a character, but he also had character. And there are things, that just really stand out in my mind about his behavior and who he was, his integrity. Garrett worked in our offices as a non-state employee for several years. We entrusted him with every one of our secrets. We held nothing back from Garrett. We trusted him totally. Garrett never violated a confidence. He used what we told him very well, and what you have in the Oregon Health Plan and the mental health contract is in large part, the good parts of it in many ways are Garrett's work. He was, as Madeline said, a great policy mind, a great inside advocate. I don't know if we'll ever have another inside advocate like Garrett was going to do, and there are lots of kinds of advocates, and we need people out on the streets, and we need Becky Childs asking the tough questions, and we need Kevin raising hell, and we need Dave Romphrey, and we need Gary Scholander. We need all of you people doing the things that you do. And you can probably never exactly duplicate what Garrett did. But you all, and we all, I think, need to take the lesson of integrity from Garrett. Garrett knew what he needed to hold close, and he knew how to use that information in very powerful ways. His respect for humanity is another part of his character that I can never forget, never want to forget. I think of one quick story about Garrett in that sense. He was asked to speak to the forensic advocates in the state hospital one time. And he walked in and he looked, and Garrett didn't see things like maybe everybody else did. He took one look around at the room, and whereas the ordinary citizen might say, these are the criminally insane, Garrett took one look at them and he said, this is a respectful group of people. And there was stunned silence, I'm told, for a minute, and they burst into applause. And it wasn't just for Garrett. It was the acknowledgement that they got from Garrett in that moment. I know people who are in this room who are very affected by Garrett's speeches and his talks, and I know that it made tremendous impacts on many people's lives. Finally, I think Garrett really knew what it took to get a job done. And just one last story that Garrett told me that I just have to share. Garrett had a very difficult time in the late 70s and early 80s. He ended up in the Aleutian Islands, and I'm not sure what all he did up there, Elizabeth. He told me that he got himself pretty wound up. It's, you know, a combination of the light and the drinking and everything else that was going on, the hours that he was keeping, and he found himself getting more and more wound up and more distressed. He had, even in that moment in his life, he had a lot of insight. He needed to get away, and he got on a plane. He flew from the Aleutian Islands. He got as far as the Seattle airport. At the Seattle airport, he was desperate. He needed to get some help. He thought of one thing, and that was the Oregon State Hospital. He got outside of the building, he hailed a taxi, and he took a taxi from the Seattle airport to Oregon State Hospital to the old Stehekin unit, where he got sober and clean and properly diagnosed for the first time in his life. And it was at that point, 21 years ago, that he really began to get on top of the issues in his life. And no, it was the Oregon State Hospital, Dave. It was, as he told it, at least a $400 taxi fare and a 200-mile ride. So I think on that note, I will leave other stories to other people.
I think a sense of loss is mitigated by a sense of connection. And that's what memorial services are for, to help us come to grips with the loss and to maybe mitigate loss by connecting with the person who has died and with the other people in that person's life. Today, we are especially lucky to have a family connection of Garrett's. Elizabeth Garrett King Hess is here joining us for the service today. She's from Florida. She is the daughter of Garrett's sister, Zona, and we're glad you're here, Elizabeth.
My mother, Zoe, is Garrett's older sister by 2 years, and they grew up together here in Oregon. And they both went to college at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Garrett came back to Oregon, and Zoe married my father and followed him to Maine, which is where Dad's family has its roots. And so my ongoing relationship with Garrett has been, in that sense, a very intermittent one because of the distance. And many of you have had much more day-to-day contact with Garrett over a longer time than I have. Although I have probably known him for longer than most of you have. I wasn't going to fuss about my name, but in fact to a little girl whose middle name is Garrett, which is an unusual one in the playground, and I got some teasing about that, but when I met Uncle Garrett, that was really quite magical to meet this other person for whom I was named, and that was a very special bond, and he was neat before I even met him at the airport when he came to visit. And I think partly because of that distance, every encounter with Garrett was a special one. I remember him as a fun guy. He was very jovial. I remember his slightly wide-eyed look and his mischievous grin, and as if he was about to reveal the punchline of a joke, and he often was. I remember him as a man who could see the humor in things, and as someone who took genuine delight in the world and the people around him. I have mosaic memories from long ago. When I was 6, my grandparents took me to visit him in Ohio. And what I remember from that visit was that they bought me a blue gumball outside the hardware store and a plastic ring that had a picture of John F. Kennedy interspersed with the American flag, and he had a dog named Hannah and a horse named Ricochet. And I still cherish a black and white photograph of a 6-year-old girl holding a bucket with a very large horse sticking his nose in. I remember Garrett also from weddings, his own and my sister's and mine. And as weddings are very happy occasions and state family events, it was very natural that he was there. And I associate him with the happiness that goes along with weddings. I also know that there were times of very great darkness in his life, as has been mentioned. He had what is now called bipolar disease or syndrome. What is it called? Disorder. And he was an alcoholic. As a little girl, I was pretty much shielded from all that stuff. And I just knew the good parts. And as I grew older, I was aware of those problems, but as a geographically distant niece, I never really had to contend with them at close quarters, although I know that there are some very hard times for those who did, and I imagine that some of you weren't strangers to that. The very good news is that eventually he got sober. A little over 15 years ago, when I was coming to terms with my own alcoholism, I found in Uncle Garrett a great friend. He listened, and he understood in ways that other people around me and close to me didn't and perhaps couldn't. And it may be a cliche to all of you, but I've only recently encountered the phrase that alcoholism is like the elephant in the living room that nobody will mention. And I can only begin to tell you how refreshing it was to be able to mention it and to talk about this thing as if it were any other thing. Well, damn, there's this elephant in the living room. And the ease with which we could talk about that led to an ease in talking about many different things, and I will always cherish that. He was a great source of information and support and guidance and inspiration, both in the example he set to me in his sobriety and in some of the stories, such as the one that Bob shared, because I didn't want to go there. And he was a beacon to down an alley that I didn't want to travel. And it's in no small measure that because of my relationship with Garrett, I'm in good shape today. Our paths diverged. When I first learned of Garrett's death, I was confronted with a constellation of thoughts and memories and feelings. Shock, sorrow, very deep regret, because I had meant to revive that relationship, and I didn't. I'm not one of those who went to Mexico, although my husband and I spoke of it often and meant to, and were going to, and we didn't do it. And I regret that very much. Of the many memories that came flooding back about Garrett, I'd like to close with my very favorite. It's from a time when I visited Uncle Garrett in Portland. I'd been out here on a business trip, and afterwards I took some vacation time, and I came down and I spent a few days with him. And we made plans to go up into the Columbia River Gorge, and on the morning that we were to leave, it rained. And as I was looking very dubiously out the window, Garrett said to me, well, you know, he said, we Oregonians just do what we're going to do and we don't let the rain get in our way. Because if you did, around here, you'd never get anything done. And we went, and it rained all day, and we had a picnic lunch, and we carried umbrellas, and we saw the waterfalls and the beautiful scenery, and we had a marvelous time. And I have taken from this, I think, one of my greatest life lessons is not to let the rain interfere with your plans or your fun or your love for and appreciation of life.
Thank you for being with us, Elizabeth. There's a strong family resemblance. Garrett's touch has been felt, as you're hearing, by many organizations and agencies and people over the past many years. He first met Maxine Stone, I think, when she was executive director of Mental Health Partners about 10 years ago. She applied his wisdom to the services that her organization built. And then she took that same wisdom with her to Eastern Oregon Psychiatry Center, where she serves as superintendent. Maxine.
I've got a cold, but I've also got a big lump in my throat as well. I'd like to share some thoughts and memories of my friend Garrett. As Maggie said, we met over 10 years ago in Oregon and worked in different organizations, but we shared the same values and interests. Our friendship really changed and grew once he moved to Mexico, made his home in Mexico about 4.5 years ago, and we discovered our mutual affection for the place. We began to exchange emails and then a series of wonderful and wonder-filled visits with each other in Mexico and Oregon. Although Garrett officially retired from the work world, he was never inactive, and he continued to take on new challenges and projects in Mexico. His move was nurtured by a love and a respect for the Mexican people and the amazing healing air and light of that land. He read and informed himself of the history and culture of the place he made his home. It was of great importance to him to understand and to communicate with Mexican people, and he worked hard to learn and improve his Spanish. He went down there with very little Spanish, but he had a lot when he left. I felt blessed to have had these times with him in Mexico, and I'd like to share a few stories and events that express how he lived and how he kept touching people and even dogs. And I hope these don't sound too trivial, but they're small stories, but they so, for me, embody Garrett and who he was. Garrett had no interest in living in town, where he could easily surround himself with other gringos and never have to speak Spanish, as many of the expatriates down there chose to live. He set out to find something outside of town, outside the larger town of San Miguel. He wanted a bit of land with a pleasant view on which to build his house, his casa, and he wanted to build it his way. His frequent trips into the countryside led him to a small, struggling village called Cabras that felt right. He started by getting to know a few folks and made it known that he was interested in buying a piece of ground to build on. Of course, at first, there was nothing for sale. No, we don't have anything. But they told him to come back and they would talk. And he kept coming back. And I'm not sure how many of these visits occurred before they trusted him. And it was presented that a senior member of the village called Domatia might be willing to sell him a small piece of land. There were legal and administrative hurdles to gain title to the land. But Garrett was patient, and he trusted that it would work out, and it did. He brought me out to the village on my first visit in January of '98, and even though he did not have clear title to the land, he had building plans and had begun to clear and prepare the lot. The site overlooked a spread-out valley and a large, shallow lake, and it was just pure magic, that view. Garrett warned me that we would be greeted by a number of boisterous, aggressive dogs, but not to worry, that he had already worked it out with the leader, a large wolf-like guy aptly named Lobo. Apparently, Lobo had first approached Garrett with a low growl, his teeth bared and ears back. Garrett offered his hand in friendship. Lobo sized him up, promptly took a whiz on the front tire of Garrett's truck, and a friendship was struck. On our visit, Garrett assured Lobo that I was okay too, but I generally brought Lobo buttered tortillas just to be sure. And then on. I think many of you know that Garrett eventually built a boarding kennel for dogs in the last year, and through this venture developed a whole new world and a whole new group of friends and dogs. And when we had a gathering for Garrett last Saturday in the village, I met people who boarded their dogs there, but I didn't know them by name. I knew their dogs' names, and Brio and Tala and Mocha and Kalu. You know them, Madeline. And it was wonderful to meet the people associated with these dogs that he loved so much. If they were well behaved and got along well, they didn't stay in the kennel. They stayed in the house with Garrett. Anyway, Garrett proceeded to hire people from the village to build his house, and by doing so to let them know that he respected and trusted them. Oh, sure, there were frustrations and a few tense moments, but he got it built, and he was to enjoy many liquid gold sunsets from that patio, as well as those moonrises you talked about. He embraced his new home and probably had more Mexican friends than non-Mexican friends. Anyway, maybe I'll tell this story. One outing in particular stands out for me, as it seemed to cement our friendship and also to indicate his sense of adventure and willingness to sample the new. He took me to a nearby town where he'd be purchasing building materials. It was not a tourist spot. It was just a working commercial town called Common Fort. It was market day, and people were selling everything from blender parts to live chickens. We wandered around, taking in the activities and the smells, and started to get very hungry, looking at all the wonderful things simmering in the food stands. We readily agreed that we should try something, knowing that some would disapprove. We had a round of gorditas with whatever looked appealing on them, and then we had some more, all the time feeling that we were rebelling and feeling smug about it. We agreed that even if we got sick, we would never tell. But we were fine, and that was the beginning of many more scrumptious plates from street stands. He often wrote about when he would go into Common Fort and stop for gorditas. He had many experiences like this, and just sharing in them with him was a rare and special treat, just to be along for the ride. The last thing I'd like to say is that what other folks have talked about, that he just offered such an inspiration and a vision for hope to everybody that he touched.
Thank you, Maxine. Garrett was many things. He was a thinker and a planner and a lobbyist and a teacher. And above all, he was an advocate for the consumers of mental health treatment. Kevin Fitz is also an advocate for consumers and survivors of mental health treatment, and he knew Garrett in many venues. I'd like to invite him up now.
Thanks, Maggie, for asking me to speak, or letting me speak. I was thinking about this day, thinking about Garrett's passing, and thinking about how he impacted my life and my family's life. And I actually talked to somebody about putting something together before I came, and I sat down a couple different times to think about what that would be, and I just had a flood of wonderful memories, a great painful sense of loss. As you know, all my life I have this sense as my father sits here, my mother sits here, and then since I met Garrett, it was like another, you know, just a sort of a surrogate parent, sort of sitting up here and chiding me to do the right thing, and encouraging me when I did the wrong thing, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to be fairly brief because I know I could probably be quite verbose, but I want to tell you a little bit about how I first met Garrett, and then how he sort of touched my life and my family's life, and how he sort of encouraged me to go where I was. I met Garrett in 1984, fall of 1984. I was had just been in Damage State Hospital and was living in a group home in Dallas, I think about 20 miles west of here, called Fur Hill. It's a private group home. And I was getting in a lot of trouble. I was flashing my genitals to the old women who lived upstairs. I was flipping off the treatment people. I was stuffing my naw vein in the, behind the medicine counter. I was riding my bicycle all the way to Corvallis 2 or 3 times a week to see my girlfriend. I was breaking all the rules, and they were telling me I was so sick and disabled I was going to be there forever, and it just made the situation worse. So my mother, who was then really involved in the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, had a bunch of friends, and so she started making some noises and found out that there was a group home in Corvallis called the Janus House. And so we was going to go over there and eat lunch there. So this man pulled up in this Volkswagen van, and his name is Garrett, and he introduced me to him, and I got in, and we went to Janus' house for the day and met all the other people there, and he talked about all the rules and said, this is the thing that you have to do if you come live with me, blah, blah, blah. I know you've had a hard patch, and they don't run this place very well, but, it'll be better over here, blah, blah, blah. And met my mother, and my mother was thrilled, like I can get out of that working class dumpy town, Dallas, and back to my hometown, Corvallis, I was living in, and I could get services through Benton County Mental Health, which would probably be much better than Polk County Mental Health, and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, so we went for the visit and went swimmingly. This man was really brilliant, encouraging, and friendly, and I felt just like, like this was a warm being, much preferred him than to any of the old burnout, hardened over, calloused over, workers at this Fur Hill place. So anyway, so we went to have a successful visit, and then about a week later, 2 weeks later, I'm gone. We're transferring all my stuff. There's a big caravan, the Volkswagen van, and my mother, and we drove all my stuff and moved me into the Janus house. And then I signed this contract, said I wouldn't do this, this, and this, and this. And, things were going really good. Garrett and I were developing a little bit of friendship. He was sort of encouraging me a little bit. But I was over here. There was a contract of things I was agreed to doing, and then, I would, on the side, I would carry out my own social agenda. And ended up, just one thing led to another, and I think I stayed there for 2.5 months, maybe 3 months tops. Garrett ended up kicking me out of the group home at the Janus house, because of some of the conflicts I had gotten in with the other staff about coming out late, or going to college parties or something. I don't know what it was, but anyway, he kicked me out. And then he said, listen, you are a very bright young man, blah, 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 and I think that you have a lot of promise, but I think you need to unwind some stuff. And I was like, well, F you, you kicked me out of here. What kind of friend are you anyway? So then I got my own place, and then Garrett down the street, and then Garrett and I would go out to lunch once a week, and he became a person in my life who would encourage me. I mean, even though I was suicidal and felt hopeless, he was just a person in my life that would encourage me. And until I actually left Corvallis, we would hang out once a week and go visit his dogs, or go walk in the park, or talk about, lots of different things. Anyway, Garrett and I sort of got separated. I moved to Portland and tried to get into a Providence dual diagnosis treatment center. They wouldn't accept me. Ended up back in Damage State Hospital, where I had been previously. My father pulls up and he's bawling. I've lost my son. He's psychotic and he's no coming back. My family's like, he had the best treatment in Oregon, and he effed that up, and what are we going to do? And everybody was like wringing their hands thinking, God dang it, Kevin. And Garrett pulled up, and he got the word through my sister that I was in trouble and didn't have to seem to have any solutions in sight. So he showed up and he said, let's go for a ride, and we went for a ride and we started talking, and he extended his friendship to me again. At the time, he said something to me that I didn't really understand, but continued to circulate through my head. He said, listen, in the place that some people are, they don't have the strength to make it their own, to make it by their own. So sometimes what I do when I'm able is loan some of my strength to the other person. And he basically was talking to people when suffering from serious mental health issues like I was at the time. And he said, I'll just loan you some of my strengths and we can hang out. And, you know, and if it gets too much, you can tell me. And so from there, Garrett and I developed a friendship where he was in person on a role that encouraged me and supported me and helped me think about my life beyond, you know, the multiple suicide attempts and the hospitalizations and the, you know, and all the legal battles that I was in. I tried to make a go of it on my own and with my own little support group, and ended up falling flat on my face and got in a big, huge, dysfunctional mess with my family. Garrett offered his home to me and said, listen, we'll help you get a job, we'll help you get stabilized, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you can rent a room here, you don't have a job yet, but you can pay it me back, blah, blah, blah. And so he did that, and I lived with him, I don't remember how long it was, 5 or 6 months for the first time, or maybe 4 months the first time. And I was, you know, charting a path to success, and a couple things happened, and I lost a job and was devastated. And Garrett was an amazing person who not only at that time was encouraging me, there were other friends of mine who were struggling with issues of dual diagnosis. We put together a weekly job support group, and my friend's like, this is kind of corny, you know, this, what are we sitting around here? There's an older man here talking to us about finding a job. And so I think the first night 6 people showed up, and then the second week 3 or 4 people showed up. But those 3 or 4 people showed up for like 3 or 4 months, and we took it quite seriously. I mean, Garrett sort of outlined a sort of 4-step program, how to find a job, how to continue to look for a job when you felt defeated, and, you know, it's just tremendous stuff. And that I really benefited from, because I think at the time I was living with Garrett, I had gone through 2 different jobs because I took it on myself to complain to the boss about the work conditions. Anyway, Garrett's nest in his home and his love and encouragement of me at that time was tremendous. Then I got my wings flying and moved out, and I think about a year later, something bad happened, or I think I broke up with a girlfriend and we split up in the apartment we were living with. So Garrett then extended his house to me again and said, you know, you can come live with me, you pay me rent, and blah, blah, blah. So I did that again, and I don't remember how long I stayed there for, but I remember Christmas, I think it was Christmas of '86 or '87. I had successfully gotten a job, and I had kept the job for a certain period of time, and I had stayed out of the hospital and hadn't done anything, you know, desperate as far as suicidal attempts. And I was driving a '74 Buick that Garrett helped me get insurance for, and helped me, you know, loan me some money for the financing of it. I think it was $500 or something. I was driving it to Corvallis in the middle of Christmas Eve day, and I was thinking about my life and how I had, you know, climbed out of a garbage can or been picked out of the garbage can by a couple people. And I started crying. I was thinking, why am I going to this way, to my parents' house, or to my parents' home in Corvallis, when, you know, I mean, although they certainly loved me, they were sort of mired in their own health challenges and financial challenges and marriage challenges. And I thought, this is bizarre that I'm leaving the man who's encouraging me and supporting me to go be with my family, who is, although I'm sure in their, you know, I'm sure they like to encourage and support me. My family at times in the past has been kind of a suck on emotions just because of all the different health challenges and stuff. So I thought that was really interesting that I had that sort of situation. One thing I wanted to say about Garrett is, and not to rain on that, kind of guy he was, but we were at his house once, and my father is very particular and very smart and very kind of fussy, and so I'm at Garrett's house, and I don't know, something's happening in the bathroom, and I broke something, or a pipe is going off, and Garrett says, "Get me a towel, Kevin, get me a towel," sort of very animated and sort of loud, and so every time anytime he would sort of raise his voice, or my father raised his voice, I mean, I think it's just transference, but I would get all panicked and confused and bump into the wall, and so I went and got a towel out of the linen closet, and I gave it to him, and he said, "Don't get a man to do a boy's job. Don't get a boy to do a man's job." I handed him this little washcloth, and so I have from time to time, I have all these adages that are like 30 or 40 years behind me that are part of sort of how I express myself, and a lot of that is the way Garrett talked. We had another one where every time I wouldn't pull the shower curtain. Every time you get done taking a shower, you want to pull the shower curtain out so it breathes. And many times he would wake me up at 6:30 in the morning letting me know that I didn't pull the shower curtain, that it had been all bunched up, growing mildew overnight. And I was like, whew. And he did that 3 or 4 times, and I sort of finally got it. There's just a particular way of going about it. But it was, and Garrett and I went clothes shopping together, and it was an amazing. I couldn't believe that these sort of things were possible, and it was only until years later I realized what a gift this person who encouraged me and supported me and took a lot of risks to open their home and their pocketbook and their heart to support this person, this young person that I was. A couple of years later, after I was sort of getting on my feet and trying to discover what I wanted to do with my life, Garrett was involved. I think he was in an executive officer position on this nonprofit called the Mind Empowered, and I was working at City Liquidators or something, and he said, there's this part-time temporary position at this organization that I'm with, and it would be great if you want to just get your feet wet and start socializing with people and sort of see if it's for you. And I started doing that in 1989, I think it was, and then from there I worked myself into a full-time position at the Mind Empowered, and Garrett's leadership and Garrett's knowledge and his friend network. Garrett had more people who know. Garrett just tremendously respected in the field of public mental health policy, at least all over Multnomah County and all over the state, as far as I could tell. And that was amazing because he was my friend and he was sort of my hero in some ways. So I worked there and got really involved in my own sort of recovery and thinking about recovery and possibilities for other people, and Garrett encouraged me to be the training officer, where I met lots of people who are probably in the audience today who came and do in-service trainings at the Mind Empowered. From there, Garrett's life moved on, I think, from Basenjis to Arabians to, whatever. One of the things about Garrett is that whatever, and this is the thing I'm perpetually jealous of, because I think the only thing that I do really well is maybe 1 or 2 things, but watching Garrett and watching his life, he seemed to be a person who could apply himself to just about anything and become just a master at it, whether it was pottery, breeding Arabian horses, building the kennel in the garage in his backyard on Farragut Street, breeding Basenji dogs. I didn't know him then, but when he was a potter, he used to tell me about some of the awards that he would get and some of the prices he would sell for some of his pottery for. Just sort of an amazing man who had a lot of skills and genius. We sort of, didn't have as much contact in the years, probably in the mid-90s, I think, because I was really involved in a relationship that kept me underwater, and he was trying to sort out his new career as sort of being an advocate at the state level, and lots of different things. Mind Empowered had come to an end or had come to a closure to some degree, and so things were changing. But we would still get together a couple times a year and go out to eat and catch up and chit-chat and see where each other's lives were and stuff. And it was in 1997, I think it was 1997, in summer of 1997, he had been talking a lot about moving and retiring to Mexico, and we would joke around about, what are you going to do down there? You don't speak English, and they're not friendly to gringos, and et cetera, et cetera. We went out to lunch, I think it was in July or August of 1997, and he said, I'm planning to do this. I'm actually going to be leaving in October if everything holds together. And I was like, I don't want this person to leave. It's like this person is in my orbit and the person I depend on just for spiritual or existential strength in the day-to-day. And also, too, he is a person, when the bottom falls out of my life, when I feel like I can't cope anymore and don't want to abandon myself to the public system, having friends like Garrett to help be a positive mirror and to somebody who helped give me some glue to put myself back together, I felt I wasn't ready for him to go. But there wasn't really much I could do about it. We threw a party, and Maxine didn't mention this. We threw a big party in late September at his house, at Maxine's house, not his house, at Maxine's house. And I was just amazed at how many people he had touched their lives in such a powerful way. At that time, when he was leaving town, I got really sad, and he said, October's coming, it's going to get dark, and I'm going to get horribly depressed, and I can't wait to get out of here. It was a difficult time because I didn't think, I was going through some changes of my own, and I didn't feel like I was ready to close the chapter on our relationship and have our relationship become, have a geographical impasse of 2,000 miles or something. And he said, whenever you need me and whenever I can be there for you, call me or write me or visit me or whatever. So I ended up visiting him, I think in May or April of 1999. Me and a really good friend of mine went down there and spent 12 days with him and a good friend of his around the village and around the town, and just was a complete different world. I was paralyzed about going because I thought, this is another culture. I don't speak the language. This is not easy for me. And spent some time on his property and looking at his view and looking at how sort of calm and centered and just peaceful he was. And I thought, man, this is paradise down here. Except for the car exhaust in San Miguel, the city. But other than that, it was an amazing place. And also an amazing thing about my hope that was realized is down there is this man is on his feet again, and he's industrious, and he's engaging not only the gringo community, but the indigenous people who've lived here forever, part of their, he's part of their family. That was an amazing experience to go down there and be in San Miguel. For me, and also to feel like I could come there and I had an anchor of safety and a friend who was welcoming and supporting and encouraging. Garrett's death, I don't know exactly when Garrett's death happened, but I'm pretty sure that I was probably awake when it happened. I think it happened sometime Saturday, early evening, and between Sunday morning and that Saturday evening. I was out at the discotheque dancing until 4:30 in the morning, and went home and did some reading and took a hot bath and couldn't sleep because I can't sleep at times, and was just laying in my bathtub and thinking about my world and my family and the people who encouraged me to support me to get as far as I do. My father has a saying that he says as of late, since he's turned 65, every time we talk, he says, "Thank God I made it this far." And I was thinking about just the people in my network that had supported me and encouraged me, and thinking about the people that I feel a debt or some obligation to, maybe not to them, but to the energy and the investment that they put in me, that I should move that forward into the world and try to provide that to others. And later on that morning, I went to this dance class I go to called Sweat Your Prayers, and somebody talked about somebody getting in a car accident or something, and I don't know what it was, but I was struck with just a tremendous amount of sadness and amount of grief and no clear understanding of where it came from. And then I heard, 3 or 4 days later that Garrett passed away, and I thought, I can't believe it is happening. And I went and I laid in my bathtub and I cried for 4 hours. And I thought, I'm not ready the shape that I was in and the shape that I felt the world was in, I thought, I'm not ready to lose people who are so close to my heart and mean so much to me and are part of my tribe or the tribe that I have grown up in. Since then, I go back and forth between thinking, man, oh man, the life that this person had, the way that he touched people's lives, the way he encouraged people, the ability that he had to, in moments of desperation where my counselor, Bill Toomey, said, you have suicidal ideation, that you have no other option but to kill yourself, no other solution beyond that. And having a person that I could talk to with that, about that and some of my issues around that in a way that was understanding and not pathologizing and not demoralizing and not trying to force a solution on me, Garrett was primo. He was a primary person in my life. And every time the shit started to come to pieces, especially those in my family who have their act together and are very supportive of me, would always reach out to Garrett and say, you know, could you touch base with Kevin, et cetera, et cetera. In 1986, I think it was maybe 1985, 1986, Garrett had been spending a lot of time powwowing with my sister, who is, I have 2 older sisters and 1 younger brother, and he spent a lot of time powwowing with her because I was living with her for a while, then I was living with him, and I was going through a lot of challenges. My sister then ended up getting pregnant. My sister named her son, an only son, Garrett, and Garrett was the godfather of, was named as Garrett Smith was named as Garrett Field's godfather, and Garrett, my nephew, doesn't have much memory of Garrett, except because he only met him in his first 3 or 4 years of life. But my sister and I were talking about it last weekend, and my sister really was a person whose heart was in the right place, but had no idea how to deal with her brother, who was psychotic and a mess and just upside down, and really felt a strong connection to Garrett as well, that our family would not be where it is if it weren't for his intervention. So today, like I said, I don't think I'm ready, and I haven't been ready and not prepared for the way the world is, and the way the world is to lose a friend and to lose a being whose enigma and light and spirit is just so broad and deep. I don't know why that gentleman decided to befriend me and encourage me the way he did, but he has inspired me to try to, I don't have the same sort of abilities or talents. I think we all have different ones, but in the same way, he impressed upon me, extending myself, trying to build community amongst people who are broken and hurting and disabled, and to try to have some joy and to promote acceptance of differences, whether it's differences in ethnicity or differences in, who you're dating, or et cetera, et cetera. Really tremendous. I used to refer to him as doing my father's job, because I always believed it was my father's job to bring me into my mother's job to bring me into the world, my father's job to teach me how to think. And my father was a practicing alcoholic from the time I was 12 to the time I was 23 or 24, and didn't have a whole lot of time to interface with my father's thinking side. But Garrett was a man I have a tremendous intellectual curiosity, and he was an apt teacher and a wonderful, patient, giving being to me in a lot of ways, and I don't think I'll ever forget him. Thank you for letting me come here and speak on and on about this man and how he's affected my life. And God, if one thing I think that I get from Garrett, and that is that he gave me, and after I stayed at Garrett's house, I introduced Garrett to a lot of other broken young people who were, suffering, who didn't know where they were going, and he became, in the young people circle that I used to run around, known as, this Mr. Self-Help Guru. I mean, if you wanted to find a job, he was, amongst the kids that I used to hang out in Northwest Portland, he was revered as a hip, old guy. So, yes. So anyway, thanks for letting me talk, and thanks for participating in Garrett's life. What a man he was. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I first met Garrett when I was a resident in training at Oregon Health Sciences University, and he became for me at that time an important messenger and teacher. And later on, when he was a patient here at Salem Hospital, after he got thrown off one of his Arabian horses, he became my friend and my verbal sparring partner. I would spend a part of each of my work days here reading to him various literature excerpts, and then we would argue passionately, usually, and he usually won. I enjoyed and benefited from all of the different roles that Garrett played with me in my life, but I think that impressionable time during my training as a resident is really when Garrett's message was most effectively conveyed. He influenced a lot of people at Oregon Health Sciences University, and among them Dr. Rupert Getz, who eventually left Oregon Health Sciences University, at least in the capacity he was in, to become Oregon's state medical director. And more recently, Rupert has moved northward to become Clackamas County Mental Health Medical Director. Rupert?
Thank you. All of us who met Garrett know that he'd understand if me being the person that I am, my German background, I can't speak about him and about someone who I respect as highly without nailing my thoughts down on paper in some Germanic attempt to try to structure what I want to say. Garrett was a gentleman. I first met him in 1995 when I joined the Office of Mental Health Services. He was director of the Office of Consumer Advocacy, and I had come as a new medical director. He was a consumer, and I was a psychiatrist. He'd lived what I'd only studied. How would our relationship begin? Garrett, as you all know him, and as you would have suspected, took the lead, and he took the lead as my teacher. Let me use his words. Mental health professionals often asked me how they could empower somebody, which betrayed their misunderstanding of their role. Empowerment comes from a person's own belief of possessing capacity. This belief is generated in part by the support and shared belief of the medical and mental health professional, and this lesson is hard to teach and hard to learn. Well, it was Garrett's capacity to sit across from me and see things through my eyes, to shape his language according to what I could understand, that was my first glimpse of true empowerment. It wasn't an easy lesson to leave aside the security blanket of my formal training focused on disability as it was, and to truly search out each person's strengths, and then use what skills I had to help them achieve the goals they set. Empowerment was not mine to give, rather it was mine to acknowledge in another and in a person who claimed it and lived it. Garrett was a powerful person, a generous person. His advice was widely sought and freely given. In my first years in position as state medical director, I was privileged to do some travel to national meetings, and I was surprised at those meetings that the name Garrett Smith often triggered more recognition of events in Oregon, triggered more stories, and opened more doors than many other names that I could mention. My last opportunity to work with Garrett was in the year 2000 as a retired professional colleague. At that time, I was attempting to capture lessons from the mental health phase-in of the Oregon Health Plan, and it was his influence that convinced me of the shape of the resulting booklet that we worked on together. Catherine helped me. We featured different perspectives in their own voices. Benson McFarland, Catherine Ross, Barry Cast, Bill Lunch, Tony Bruskowski, and others joined Garrett Smith with their chapters and their personal perspectives. What had we learned? Well, if I think about Garrett, there is a lesson. And it is that lesson of listening. Let me close again with letting him speak through a few lines from this same booklet that we were able to put together. Nationally, there's a raging debate and a plethora of initiatives addressing the issue of quality assurance, what to measure, how to measure, who measures, who defines desired outcomes, what constitutes quality, what's a minimum level of adequacy, and so forth. These debates seem endless and are often self-serving, conflicting, and worthy of the best dialogue heard at the Tower of Babel. When all this is sorted out, consumers may well ask, isn't the point of mental health system to assist people to get better? If so, shouldn't consumers define what constitutes better? Well, Garrett, for my part, I hope I've heard you. I won't forget.
Thank you, Dr. Getz, and thank you all who have shared. This is an opportunity for all of you to have a moment, at least, or an opportunity, I should say, if you'd like to take it, to share a memory or two about the way Garrett has impacted you in your life. There will also be a time to do that informally following this memorial time, where we can share a time informally out in the lobby and share those stories as well. But we would like to give you the opportunity in this moment to share any story or a memory or a particular way in which Garrett has impacted you. We have a microphone that Tim has in the back there, and we'll take it around to you, so you don't need to get up from where you are. If you just kind of raise your hand if you have something you'd like to share, we'll accommodate you that way. Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, my name is David Rompre. I presently work at the Oregon Health and Science University Center on Self-Determination. And I really appreciated, Dr. Getz, your comments about consumers saying what good mental health treatment really has been for them. I was just at a meeting the other day in Portland led by Mike Libacek with Octave, some consumers who are looking at developing a training in self-advocacy, things like telling your psychiatrist, well, this medication doesn't work, or telling your case manager, I don't quite like this boarding house, you got any other options? Things surprisingly a lot of over-medicated or passive people don't do. And one of the guys there, consumer there, took issue with the group's consensus to try to include a bit in the training, the materials we're going to develop, about a little bit about the history of the self-help movement in Oregon. He said, well, I don't quite see what that has to do with anything so what we're doing. It seems to me like you're trying to espouse a certain ideology, including this history. And my ire was raised because I knew that he wouldn't be in that format with Carl Weir from the mental health division there, had not some major glasnost took place. And if there ever was a Berlin Wall between the mental health consumers and the mental health division, then perhaps Garrett was Gorbachev, lacking the big blotch on the head. But just one thing I want to say. 1990, I was in the cafeteria of the University of Oregon, and I wasn't a student. I was on pass from the Oregon State Hospital, the forensic program, at a consumer conference there. And I was sitting by myself, and fortuitously or whatever, Garrett came by, just sat down by me, and he was one of the big head honchos of the whole thing, and asked who I was, and I volunteered that I was at the state hospital, and that's all I was. I was just a forensic mental patient, and definitely alternately throughout the whole conference I was feeling like, veritable trash, just I'm a forensic patient, and he just, I don't remember what he said, but it's really moot what he said, because he he's something to the effect of, well, when you get out of there, maybe you can help organize some things and help people out, and even while you're in. And it was a real spark. I went back to the state hospital and was helpful in starting a group there. But Bob Dylan has a song, Dignity. He asks a question, have you seen Dignity? There's a line, I went to the wedding of Mary Lou, and she said, well, it's been sure nice talking to you. It's just kind of the experience a lot of people have when they reveal they have a diagnosis. Like, well, good to see you again, But that man knew how to speak to a person's dignity. And upon that platform, upon that glasnost, I think the mental health system is changing in Oregon.
Thank you.
My name's Scott Snedeker, and I worked with Garrett for a couple of years at the Mind Empowered. And a couple of things about him that I think are real important to mention, and that is one of the things that was a powerful message that he always carried was that we can't let go of the idea of the state or the government, their responsibility in doing social services, that we have to hold the state and the government and the federal and the local governments all accountable to make sure these things happen, because the resources keep dwindling, and we have to make sure that the things that count continue on. And I think that was a powerful message of his. He and I didn't always get along, as some people might know. Maggie was talking about arguing. Garrett and I tended to argue a lot, and we'd always try to go on top of each. I'd try to tell him some fact, and then he'd try to tell me some fact. We'd always be trying to correct each other. But one of the things that was very it was kind of invisible to me when it happened, was that when I had been laid off at the Mind Empowered, there was some turmoil going on at the time. He had gotten me connected with an actual program that would measure outcomes for people in the Passages Project. And it gave me some real good experience at the time. And he actually did some revisions to the quality of life interview that we were doing. And it actually looked at things that were going on with people rather than how fast did they get in contact with an appointment or those kinds of measures. And I try to convince the bureaucrats and the technocrats, of which I am one, but to the ones I work with, to say, hey, come on, let's look at actual changes in people's lives. And I think that was important to him. Also, when I traveled around the country, people would, they go, "You're from Oregon. Do you know Garrett Smith?" He was well known around our nation as a very prominent advocate, and I just wanted to say that even though we had some difficulty getting along, that when I started doing work for Multnomah County about a year and a half ago, I thought, I better get in contact with Garrett, because I'm in a tough situation here. And so I called Bob Nickel and I said, give me Garrett's email. So I sent him an email, and he was happy to help me out with just trying to hang in there where I am now. So I appreciate who he was, and I'm proud to have known him. And for all the things that all of us do in the consumer movement, especially here in the state of Oregon, he is responsible. And I just wanted to say those things. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My name is Jody Harmon, and I used to be in the mental health system And I met Garrett because I was put into Janice House back in '84, '85, and he was the director then. He was so, well, my experience in the mental health system is being demeaned and treated like a bug. Garrett wasn't anything like that. He never tried to hide his elephants, as put it, which made it much easier to talk to him, because my experiences in the mental health field were having my elephants pointed out, and of course I'm seeing the other person's, but they're denying they're there. Garrett never denied he had problems, so it made him a human being, easy to connect with. He immediately discovered that I liked animals. He did also. And we had a connection there. And we did argue. We argued face to face and eyeball to eyeball at Janice House. And he was the only one that I'd met in the mental health system that did not pathologize me for that or call it symptomatic and try to force more psych drugs on me. So when he left Janice House, I was in there a year, and I did not see him again until the Voices of Hope conference that Octa and Kevin put together in Portland. It was the first conference I'd ever had. I left the mental health system. I had a severe abuse incident. I'd been homeless after that. I had no one that I felt in the world cared at all what happened except for stray cats, and I'd been living with some stray cats along the river, and I had been trying to point out the abuses within the system at Corvallis, pretty much never heard and put down for even speaking of it. And when I saw Garrett at the Voices of Hope conference, he told me he was living in Mexico. He knew what happens. He knows what goes on in the mental health system. It was just nice to see him, and I'm happy he died in Mexico, because he told me how peaceful it was there and how beautiful the land was and the people. And it makes me happy that he died in such a nice place.
Thank you very much. I think there's one in the back, Tim, there. Wasn't there, the lady? I think you had your hand up, yeah.
I'm the recrier, and I probably was the first mental health worker that became acquainted with Garrett in 1982, right after he was released from Oregon State Hospital, and he was hired as the manager of the Catherine Apartments that was operated by Mental Health Services West. We became colleagues and friends, and as I read through his career, our careers followed each other very, very closely. But early on, he was hired at Mental Health Services West in, I think it was mid-September or something, and he was still kind of alone, isolated, and I invited him to our home in Corvallis to have Thanksgiving dinner with us and spend the night. And every time I've seen Garrett since then, he's told me how much that he appreciated that invitation to have Thanksgiving dinner with us. In fact, just last fall, when he was here visiting, he repeated that same thing again to me. And everything that everyone said here, I agree with. It's a very sad time that we've lost such a great friend.
Thank you very much.
My name is Mike Liebachuk, and I was Garrett's boss for a couple of years, and I know that sounds silly, and it was in a sense, but as president of the board of Mind Empowered, I was technically his boss. What an easy job of supervising somebody that was. About the third time that I went to Garrett's house, he had one of his dogs in the living room, and he said, don't worry, it won't bark. It's a Basenji, it never barks. And at that point, the Basenji barked. And Garrett looked kind of, confused, and he apologized and said, it's the first time I've seen that, and they don't do that. And but Garrett had a way of responding to things that came out a little bit differently than planned, and he responded to the needs of the consumers in this state very well. When I hear people, I still hear people say, we'll empower this person or we'll empower that group. I remember Garrett's frustration at hearing that phrase and saying, no person, no group can empower another. Empowerment can be fostered, but empowerment comes from within the individual or within the group. And when I think about things that I still hear today that kind of rattle my brain, and I think, wait, who am I to stand up against? I remember Garrett said. And so I remember how Garrett would stand on something that he believed in, even though, you know, the winds of the current expression or what a society would say differently, he would stand up for what he believed in and fight for it. I admire that about Garrett. One thing perhaps about Garrett that is more than his mental ability or even his intestinal fortitude was his ability to see somebody on their level. And when you talked with him, you not only knew that your words were being heard, but all of you was being heard and taken in. And I'm going to miss him. I think everybody in this room will. We've lost someone that we can carry with us.
Thank you very much.
My name is Tom Adams. Here's what Garrett did for me. He took me under his wing. And in fact, he let me live with him. And it wasn't anything in particular that he did that helped. It was what he showed me. And here's what happened. Severe alcoholism and I suppose mental health issues. And sometimes we would talk about if one led to the other and if the alcoholic took on mental health problems as a result of the alcoholism, or if the person with a mental health problem sought solace in alcohol or drugs. But he took a step around that. For the first month I was living with him, I continued to drink, but I lied to him. And then one night, I was sitting in the living room by myself, and it was like 1 or 2 in the morning. And by the way, I remember that dog, Obi. What a great dog. Never heard her bark, though. And I was sitting in front of the computer, and I wasn't doing anything in particular except for playing solitaire, but I had a half case of beer out in the backyard, and this had been going on night after night. And each day I would lie to him that I wasn't drinking anymore. And he had this dog named Stryker. Probably some people maybe remember Stryker, a great Doberman Pinscher. And he wanted to put Stryker out in the backyard. And so that was that. I mean, he walked out back, and I mean, I'm sitting in front of the computer, and everything's going through my head. And man, he's going to kick me out. He's going to reject me. All these things were going through my head. And he saw the beer, and he just came back in, and he was completely silent, and he didn't say a thing to me. All that he did was he put his hand on my shoulder. And that was it. It was unconditional love. And it just shot right to my heart. In the next 6 days, I drank 2 or 3 times. And then on February 13th of 1997, I took my last drink.
Thank you. I will invite you, as I mentioned, to kind of continue your sharing informally as a time of reception will be provided in the back of the auditorium out in the lobby there where you came in. The planners of this service have asked me simply to try to pull together some of the threads and things that you have said. There is no way I could add any more meaning to what has been said here for your words and your testimonies, and the impact that Garrett has given on your lives is the meaning of what this whole service is about. You've answered the question for me, and perhaps the question for all of us is, what impact can I have on life? And your answer, as you have talked about Garrett this afternoon, is that the true impact happens, does it not, to the human spirit of others as our human spirit intersects with theirs. That's the impact of life. And the things that you have shared have been so much more, as we've mentioned, about what the events have been, but it's really the way that that human spirit of Garrett has impacted yours. Kevin, you asked a very important question in your sharing. How can we go on in a world like we live in without persons like Garrett, who have been very integral, and your support person, and just helped people who have been helpful to you at crucial times? I think that is a question for each of us and each of you as colleagues in the mental health field, is how do you go on, and how do you continue to work in a life that has all of the same problems that have been a part of your field and that Garrett has tried to address? And let me just humbly try to pose an answer to your question, Kevin. I don't think it's the right answer, it's just an answer. I think part of the answer comes from what I understand you to talk about Garrett, that I think what he has tried to do is to be with people so that when they change of their own efforts, they are able to be with other people so that they can change by virtue of their own efforts. And if there is a way to continue to live in the realities of the world, it is really, seems to me, to be simply that. To know that there have been other people in this room and many others who have been changed by Garrett and people like Garrett, that his spirit and the spirit of strength that he has shared continues to be available to each of you. The counsel that he shared to professionals as a consumer continues to be available to you in those people that he has shared with sitting all around you in this auditorium and many others. The last thing I want to share with you that I hope will tie things together for you in an image comes from my world of theology and ministry. It's an image of what's called the wounded healer, and it may even be an image that's known to you by Henry Nouwen, a Dutch theologian. And I just share this that seems to have, as you've shared, to really hit home about Garrett. The real wounded healer means a witness who starts with the willingness to cry with those who cry, laugh with those who laugh, and to make one's own painful and joyful experiences available as sources of clarification and understanding. That is Garrett's legacy, a wounded healer that advocated and impacted your lives. And those gifts continue to be available as close as your own heart and your own spirit.
A thinker, a teacher, a debater, a friend, a brother, a father. The diverse ways that Garrett touched your lives, our lives, is really represented in the diversity in the room today. And I hope we can end this discussion with a lot of respect, love, and admiration for those issues of challenge. And one of the questions that Kevin referred to also was someone giving someone else power. And perhaps what we can do ourselves with the memories and the way that Garrett touched our lives is take some of that power and pass it forward to those that we encounter. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the presentation. We invite you to the lobby to share some coffee and tea.
Thank you for coming. It's an honor to have hosted you. You will be exiting to the music of Man of La Mancha, which was Garrett's favorite musical. Thank you.
Levitas, gravitas. Thanks, folks.
Impersonate a man. Come, enter into my imagination and see. Holy, hollow-faced, eyes that burn with the fire of inner vision. He conceives the strangest project ever imagined. To be on a knight errant and sally forth into the world righting all wrongs. His name, Don Quixote de la Mancha. Hear me now, the bleak and unbearable world, how base and debauched as can be. And the knight with his banners all bravely unfurled now hurls down his gauntlet to thee. Am I Don Quixote, the Lord of La Mancha? My destiny calls and I go, and the wild wings of fortune shall carry me onward, oh, whithersoever they blow. Whithersoever they blow, onward to glory I go. I'm Sancho, yes, I'm Sancho. I'll follow my master till the end. I'll tell all the world proudly I'm his squire, I'm his friend. Hear me, heathens and wizards and servants of sin, all your dastardly doings are past. For a holy endeavor is now to begin, and virtue shall triumph at last. I am Don Quixote, the Lord of La Mancha. My destiny calls and I go, and the wild wings of fortune shall carry me onward, oh, whithersoever they blow. I'm his friend. Whithersoever